It was a Cessna 150, a small aircraft for those of you that don't know. I was learning how to fly, and my instructor had kicked me out of the nest, so to speak, not long before. I was doing the thing that all pilots do. It's called touch and goes. That means doing takeoffs and landings repeatedly, which I had been doing for quite some time by then. It was my first time out that day. I was on the runway and had pushed the throttle forward and was approaching takeoff speed when my eyes looked down to the airspeed indicator, and it was on 0. But I knew I had to be doing takeoff speed. So what do you suppose went through my mind? I know how fast I'm going. It'll be fine. After all, I've done this many times. Now, this is where I better not be kidding myself, for it really is time to think, wouldn't you say? It could be life or death. But I must admit, for a few seconds, I kept right on going. But then common sense and reason settled in to pull back on the throttle and get off the runway to examine why the speed indicator wasn't working. Well, of course, it was only a bug stuck in the air intake. Now, what's my point? Most all of us can be faced with things in life that it wouldn't be too wise to ignore. But sometimes, some of us can be very stubborn. We may even think we already have enough oil in our lamps. In other words, we may think we already have the light of truth. So don't confuse me with your facts. But when it comes to religion, maybe we should compare our minds with a parachute. If we were to jump out of an airplane, would our parachute open enough to bring us to safety? To have an open mind is very closely related to having a teachable spirit. So simply realize that having a teachable spirit is the first requirement, because now God has a teachable person, a person that's willing to check out the evidence. I know it can be very difficult viewing a different concept, because you may have believed certain things to be the truth since childhood, just like me. But a time came when I couldn't ignore the evidence. You may have been taught that God would be angry with you for investigating. But who do you suppose would want to keep us in the dark and away from common sense and reason? Need I say any more? I must make it very clear that our salvation does not depend on believing certain concepts. Our salvation is between us and God. God knows the sincerity of our heart. He knows if we are teachable or not. As said before, God will save all that trust Him, regardless of what faith we are following. The enemy would like us to believe that the exclusive trend of believing one of the more than 1,000 different religions is the only way we can be saved. Satan has the religions of the world arguing over some special way to be saved, because he knows that will keep us so busy concentrating on certain rules, we won't have time to spend on what God is really like. In 1 Corinthians 2, there's a story about the Apostle Paul deciding that he was only going to discuss Christ and Him crucified, or the kind of person God is and why He came to die. And the more you get into this message, the more it should be evident that this is the same model of talking about the kind of person God is and why He came to die. So understand that I'm not here to argue over your belief system. It no doubt has served you well. It has brought you to be interested in spiritual things, or you wouldn't be listening to this. My only concern is to point out to everyone what God the Father is really like, which sometimes has to come from stages of growth. It's a process of learning to trust nothing but the ways of God that Jesus came to reveal. And those ways are found within the many Bible stories about Jesus and the parables He gave. So the ultimate good news is that Jesus said, "If you have seen me, you have seen the Father." So we simply need to understand that God the Father has the same compassionate concern for us as Jesus does. And this fact becomes more vital to understand as we approach the end of time, because it's about giving us the evidence to what God is really like, so as to detect the deceiver as he attempts to impersonate the second coming of Jesus. And before that time comes, there may be some things we need to learn. Of course, it's a good thing if you are committed to serve God through whatever faith you have chosen. And we would never want to discount how that has helped you cope with life. But again, it might not be too wise to ignore that there could be more to learn. Just for an example, we might want to dig deeper into why God has allowed all the religions of the world and why it is so important to God that we discover the one way to determine real truth. We should realize that God knows what He's doing. He knows what He's doing to teach us. Even though it might be hard for us to understand, He has set the stage for us to be deceived. Over 1,000 different ways, all the religions of the world. This is simply God's method of teaching. The teacher, again, has set the stage so to reveal that it wouldn't be too wise to ignore the evidence within the stories. If we could have the courage to open the door, we might discover that we have based certain beliefs upon the statements instead of the stories. As an example, the statement in Hebrews 9:22, without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. Spiritual people the world over have just assumed that God the Father wouldn't forgive without the shedding of Christ's blood. So wouldn't that be saying that Jesus had to die before God the Father would forgive? Doesn't something have to be wrong with that concept? But now, let's put all the stories together about the life of Jesus that point to His being loving, forgiveness over and over, again, within all the stories. Then Jesus does make a statement that if you have seen me, you've seen the Father. Doesn't that suggest that there must be more to it than the Christian world is telling? Could there really be a different reason for Christ's death on the cross, something more than gaining forgiveness? You see, gaining forgiveness has been portrayed as the big issue. But could that be one of the great deceptions? For example, we might believe that some special legal concept for gaining forgiveness is what saves us, when the evidence points to a different direction. And if the next section reveals evidence for that, we just might want to pull off the runway of busyness to check things out. We might find that there is a bug plugging up the airflow, so to speak, getting in the way of more to learn. In other words, it wouldn't be too wise to ignore that it just might be time to think.